All right, now that we've gone over some principles about REST, about idempotency and safety, let's try to apply a little bit of this in looking at some of the things that we're going to need to do when we make our APIs, our RESTful designs. Again, a lot of this is review, but I just think it's useful to talk about it in a bit more depth than I did the first time. So on homework 7, we had our good books schema. And so we had books here, and they have an ID and a title and a year, and they have a complete participation in authorship, and for every book there is a single author. So we go to authors, and each author has a name and an ID. And again, an author can be an author of many books, though. All right, but every book has to have one and only one author. This is, we've mentioned in the assignment, not a great design because books can have multiple authors, but it's the way we set it up initially here. We talked about, I'll get to that in a moment, we talked about having reading lists. And each reading list has a name, and we can place on the list books, but a book does not have to be on a list, and a reading list doesn't have to have any books. So it's a many-to-many relationship. We would design our system so that it had some users, and each user has a name and an email. All right. And we were going to have them so that they could rate books. So they're going to have ratings. And on each rating is an attribute. I mean, in the ratings, relationship is a rating attribute. And ratings go to the books. So a book can have many users who've rated it, and users can have many books that they've rated. And we can also have a notion of, are the reading lists a relationship? So the users, so each reading list basically has one user, and every reading list has to have one user, but a user can have many reading lists. So this was our good books system. I just wanted to really quickly review that for you. Now, we never did anything with regards to the API. Yes, we made, we enhanced the models, and we even added to the schema, but we didn't deal with the issue of routes. What is the API for our web app? How are we going to talk about and do stuff with it? So in designing our API for good books, basically we need to understand the operations we want to allow, because there's always an infinite amount of stuff that you could do. And we would know this, we would be dealing with talking to users, our client, all sorts of things. Rather than give a full blow-by-blow of everything, let's have some examples, okay? So some examples of what we might want to be able to do is, as a user, I should be able to create a new empty reading list. Sounds good. And this sort of functionality, you go, okay, well, I don't even know necessarily how the mock-up is going to be, but make a reading list. I bet I'm going to be having a post because I'm going to be making it. Okay, so I know it's a post, and yeah, there's a good chance it's going to be a resource. And I'm going to have a collection of reading lists, and I'm going to allow them to post to create a new one. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. As a user, I should be able to add a book to an existing reading list. All right. This can go on and on. Likewise, as a user, I should be able to rate a book. And we might as well continue one more. As a user, I should be able to retrieve my ratings, for example. All right, etc., etc. There's all sorts of these things. Now, these functions need to somehow be supported by our API. And of course, there'll be a user interface on top of it. And the user interface is what then is sent via HTML to the user's client in their browser. And that browser then, using that HTML, makes those requests to our API. It does the posts, the deletes, the patches. It's all in the HTML code that does that. We process it and the responses go back. So again, our web app, we think of it as that we have created an API at the web layer, and it's the user interface that's making these requests to what we defined to be able to process and allow. Okay. All right. So there's some of these things that we have, look, books is an obvious collection resource. All right. And so we should just simply adopt the standard RESTful API for such a thing. And we do that in Rails very simply. In routes.rb, we just go and we say resources books. And boom, as we've shown before, you'll get all these routes created, get/books, get/books/new. Now, you're like, wait a minute, books/new, what is that? Oh, you're getting it. It's a document resource. The document is the HTML form. All right. So we get all of those. They're named standard. We've got our good HTTP verbs. And if you look at them, they fit all the basic rules that we had for URIs and resources and things like that. All right. And then they also have standard actions in a books controller and so forth and so on. And now the same would go for authors. That's pretty clear. We want some standard resources for them. So really quickly, we can just know that we're going to, have a resource. We're going to have it be books is a collection, and then we'll use numeric identifiers for the document resources for the individual books. Okay, now let's look at something else. These join tables are a bit more confusing. What about reading lists? All right. So one question would be, you might be wondering, should we nest reading lists under a user? So again, now this is the question is, should we be using slashes? Does it make sense for us? So we've got the collection of users. We have user 23. And then let's say user 23 has a collection of reading lists. And that's the 6th reading list or something like that it belongs to user 23. Or should reading lists be their own resource? In other words, not nested under anything. So just simply, we'd get to that same reading list, but it would just be reading lists /6. And we wouldn't stick it in our API underneath users. All right, now, we might ask, well, do they belong to a single user? And the answer is in our app, yes, they do. So we don't have it set up so that users share reading lists. So this reading list is only for this user. So it kind of makes sense to put it that way. Now, you might say for a moment, you go, well, wait a minute. Just a second ago, you said authors is an obvious resource, and just go ahead and do, resources authors in the routes table. Well, we do that. Authors isn't going to be we're not going to have something that's like books /5/authors/2 and control that author to that book. But, every book has only one author. Or I guess the correct way would have been authors/books, because the book only has one author. Yeah, that's the way it would be. So it'd be authors, blah, 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 /books, whatever. But we know that we don't really want to do that, because in the future, we know that book, where we could create other books that might have multiple authors. And that doesn't work then. So then our API needs to totally be redesigned. And we don't want to totally redesign our API. Same thing goes for reading lists, by the way. We might in the future want to allow users to share reading lists with someone else. We might even want to have jointly owned reading lists. We might want to be able to have a pair of friends maintain a reading list. I don't know, maybe. I think what I really want to say here is that when it comes to design in these routes, is that if in doubt, so if you have any doubt at all, don't nest collection resources. You're probably asking for more trouble than it's worth. Okay, so so actually, a moment ago I said about join tables. Well, we're not really to the join tables. Reading lists is another entity. Okay, another entity set. So, but on this one, yeah, should we nest it? I actually think the answer is no. Because if in doubt, don't do it. It'll probably be simpler to just have it on its own, okay? And it gives more flexibility in the future for a change in the design. Certainly, there are some times that some things make a ton of sense. The classic one is, I've got a document and I'm going to have a set of comments on that document that show up at the bottom of the page. Well, those comments don't apply to any other document in the system ever for whatever reason. maybe we should nest comments under like the newspaper article where they show up. Maybe that does make a ton of sense, okay? But you got to think carefully about whether you want to nest resources or not. All right. Now, what about the relationships? This is what I wanted to get to. So in other words, if in doubt, yeah, make your entities their own nice resources. And in special cases, when you really think it's necessary, nest your resources, okay? But really, it needs to be clear that you want to do that, and you're not going to want to change that at some point. So what about relationships? So we have, you know, books on a reading list. And we do that with a join table, because again, we have this many-to-many relationship between books and reading lists. So the question is how to represent adding a book to a reading list. All right. Likewise, I'm going to say we have the ratings. So books on our reading list, and then we also have ratings. So a book has ratings, and ratings is also a relationship between users and books. Okay, so how to represent adding a book to reading list? Rate a book. How are we going to do that? How are we going to have the API? Because again, we're in the situation where we got this relationship set, either this between books and reading lists, or the relationship between users and books for ratings, and we want to add in a new rating, or we want to add in the notion that this book is on this reading list. Okay, I think in these cases, when we come up with the API design, there's a bit more flexibility. It's not so obvious what to do, what to call a resource, and so forth and so on. But some questions that can help us is the relationship a resource, or is it a property of existing resources? Because if it is a resource, we know how to deal with it directly, right? So if the relationship in and of itself, we think of it as a resource, something that is created, deleted, updated, whatever, and that we would want to uniquely refer to, and so forth and so on, then from the web perspective, we can treat it as a resource. Okay, and then we know what the standard ways of dealing with treating resources are, because we're really familiar with that. So if we decide the relationship itself is a resource, then we just go ahead and we model things following the notion of resources. And we would have a way to uniquely identify it, and so forth and so on. On the other hand, we might want to think of it as just, no. It's not an entity in of itself, so to speak. It's something that's just simply, it's a property of the entity, you know. So it's just like when we set up these associations and we see, so we set up an association between books and reading lists. We could think of it, the reading list, as being a property of the books, and the books being a property of the reading lists. We don't necessarily need to think of the relationship itself as a resource of its own. Okay. Now, good books is neat because it's got these two relationships, and they are different in my opinion. So again, as I already said, if it's a resource, model is a resource, but if it's an attribute or property of an existing resource, there are many ways of doing this. So what do we know? I'm going to tell you that ratings is a resource. Okay. How do we know it's a resource to be dealt with? Well, big thing is it has its own attribute. So it has the rating. That's one big thing. So we're going to want to be able to access that. And to do that, we're going to have a nice model. And we're going to, that model, then it makes sense to say that model is a resource because it's often the way. And so we're going to we can deal with that table, even though it's a joined table, we can deal with it as a resource. And I would say the other thing to note about it is don't nest it. So don't put it underneath books and don't put it underneath users. It doesn't belong really to either one of those. And so it would live on its own. And the way that we're often going to use it is a user is going to see the ratings for themselves, or a book's going to see its ratings. Sure, you could ask, I want to see the books I've rated and so forth, but that's not as common. So it kind of lives nicely sort of like as a resource on its own, even though it functions as a join table between those two and it has a relationship between them. More complex is dealing with reading lists. So reading lists don't have their own attribute. It's not clear, should they really be a resource on their own. All right, so what sort of ideas can we have for adding a book to a reading list? You know, so let's think about it. So we could have a situation where, given a list, add a book to it. And you would see this in your code. You would have something where you had some reading list. You have this association books, and you've got some book, and you would add it in there, okay? And so now this book would be put onto that reading list. And again, this is like a variable, and this is a variable, and then this is a method, and this is the push this onto there. Likewise, we could also think about it in terms of given a book, add it to a list. All right, so we might have a book. We can access the reading lists that it is on. And if we had another reading list in hand, we could do that. So here we have this notion of like, we could be working from the reading lists to add. So we got a reading list in hand and we add a book to it, or we could have a book and we could put it on a reading list, okay? So put it on a reading list. So, and we might even build our application to do both directions. But when we look at it like this, yeah, this notion, this relationship, it makes it look like it's just a property of being a book or a property of being a reading list. It's not like it's on its own. It doesn't have its own attributes. So we can think of it as maybe like we're changing the book and we're changing the reading list, because this is an attribute of these and we're going to modify them. All right, so if we're modifying an attribute of an object, what does it really mean? Well, that's where we get into things like we want to patch and update a reading list. We want to update it. We're going to change it. We're going to add something to you. So we could be thinking of, we're going to be doing something, some sort of API call that's going to be changing these. Okay, that kind of guides us in how to design this. Note, if we did in the future somehow want to describe the notion of being on a reading list and start to put attributes on that relationship, going down the path that we're headed now to treat it as changing books or changing reading lists, we'd have to unwind all of that and redo our API. So the caution here is perhaps think twice before not making a relationship a resource in and of itself to be controlled and manipulated. Because if you make it a resource in and of itself, that gives you future sort of expansion capabilities to add attributes to that relationship, to that join table, and treat it as a resource on of its own. But let's go ahead with this idea of sort of it is a attribute, and we're going to be changing those objects. And so with that in mind, that would get us to something with possible routes like this. So we might say, oh yeah, I'm going to patch, as I said. I got the books, and I have an ID. And what I do when I patch it is I send in a, with a parameter, in the form that's being, so patch is going to send the form to this URI. And we could make some sort of parameter such as, you know, add reading list to, add reading list ID. So we're able to have some sort of parameter where we're supplying a reading list ID, and we're going to patch books so it can then get that reading list and add it to its collection of reading lists to put that book on this new reading list. Okay, that sounds pretty cool. I like that. Likewise, we could do it the opposite direction as well. We could send a patch to reading lists. And we've got some ID for the reading list, and we'd have some parameter, and we would post, which would be what is the book ID that we want to be adding to that reading list. Now, there's a downside to that. You may have thought about this already. So patch to books with an ID and patch to reading lists with an ID. These are the routes for editing. Which of course makes sense because we are editing. So for editing a book and a reading list. I regret reading list being such a long word. Anyways, so why is that a downside? Why is that something to think twice about, so to speak? Well, you know, this makes the controller code for edit a bit trickier. Because you're only going to get, when you do this, we're probably not going to be changing anything else. We could put it on the edit the book page. We could put it on the edit the patch page or something. But instead, it's more like it's a request. It's a request to go change this object, change this resource. And that's this patch notion. Patch, I want you to go change something. Go do something for me. It's like a request. So it might be a little tricky to write this code. So you might end up having to have sort of a statement that says, ooh, did I have this parameter? If so, I'm going to go run this code. But if I don't have this parameter, oh, I know it's my regular, you know, edit page for the reading list. Same thing for book. Oh, it's my regular edit page for the book. Ooh, no, I had an add reading list ID. Oh, that's a special, I know that's a special request, and I'm going to go handle that special request. Then again, I guess it's not that hard. It's just like if this parameters exist, run some code to change the book object, and then you could go and run the rest of the edit code. I actually like that. I actually like that quite a bit. I don't know why I was so down on that. That's not bad. Yeah, it wouldn't be that hard. It's not that hard to code that up, I don't think. Now you might have some different redirects. So if you're adding the reading list, adding a book to the reading list, you might redirect differently than if you're editing the reading list, and same thing for the book. So you still might need to have some if statements based upon, oh, I did this, so I know I need to redirect here rather than where I would normally redirect. So it might be a little bit more tricky to code the controller, but it might be quite reasonable. You could also think about sort of, pulling this out, to separate this out rather than have it built on top of books and reading lists. You could, maybe I want to do a patch to something called list books, and I go and I send in the list ID and I send in the book ID. All right, I could do that, and then maybe you make it so that you say, yeah, and so you got some controller, and when it gets this request, it's going to be sure that the book is on the list ID on that reading list. And when your controller gets a delete for this, you get rid of that connection. All right. Again, you still might need to handle sort of different redirects and things like that, because again, adding a book to a list is one thing, and adding a list to a book it's the same idea, but it might be a different place in the user interface, and so you might have a different redirect. So this could be a little tricky. And also, it's kind of weird. Like, I guess this whole thing ends up being a resource, but am I violating the rules of slashes? Is this really am I really showing a hierarchical set of things here? Maybe this is not the best design. Alternatively, maybe we say, so that's an option. And I think this is important to note. Like when we design things, we often, come up with multiple ideas, and we roll them around and we try them out because we don't know what exactly is the right thing. Maybe you set it up as a controller resource. And so you might have something where we post to, and again, we'll have it be separated out. We call list books, and we go with book ID. And again, with the list ID, the same issues about, I'm not using these slashes in a good way, but then I could, we add our verb to the end, which is add list to book. Okay. And I could have another one, which was add book to list. Aha. So again, now it's a controller resource, and so we do post. We're not patching, we're posting, because we're always going to we're calling this procedure, and we're passing in these parameters. Again, we could put this type of procedure elsewhere in the app as well, maybe. And maybe we really should be passing these in some sort of form rather than putting them in the URI. I don't know. The rules are not that particular. Or maybe we could, create, as I said, we could put these controller resources elsewhere. Maybe it does make sense. We could end up with, we could post to books, and we have the ID of the book. And then we could say that we want to add a reading list. All right. And then what we do is we pass the reading list ID as, maybe it's a hidden parameter or something, but it's in the form. Okay, some form that when submitted has a reading list ID as probably as a hidden tag, and then it comes into this, and then the controller, we've written a separate method to handle this, and so we don't end up having to write the to write a fancy method for our editing of the book, but we were just write a particular method for this one, and we know it's adding the reading list to this book, and we pass in this parameter in a hidden tag. That's kind of nice too. I like that. And I think that might be legit, because this is, a controller resource is designed to change other resources, and we're saying which other resource we want it to change. And we're giving it some input in this way to do that. And likewise, you could write one that was to remove the reading list from the book, okay? That would be a different controller action, and you would post to remove. So you could have a remove reading list, and this would be another post, All right, so you could do the remove, and so you'd have these two controller resources. You call them, and they make changes based upon the ID here and the book ID there, and it's all in the books controller then. What's the best approach? Look, I'll be honest with you. Absolutely. What is the best approach to take? The best approach to take is the one that you are able to write the fastest and with the least likelihood to make a bug. So it works, and it was easy. The easiest thing that works, I'm going to tell you, is the right thing to do. That's the best design for you. So again, I also want you to remember, when push comes to shove, you are just writing a way to call some code. You're sending some data in, and you're going to run some code and make some changes to the app. When push comes to shove, just remember that and get it to work. Okay? Yeah, absolutely. We're going to try to follow RESTful designs, and I think they can guide us on a lot of things, especially for regular resources. We've got collections and document resources, and Rails makes it really easy for us to do that, and we should do that. Like the ratings relationship. Yeah, it's actually a good resource, and we can just follow that whole thing exactly. The reading list one, if we don't want to treat it as a resource in and of itself, we have lots of options and with lots of different ways. And you can go on the web and you can read tons of people going, what about this way? What about that way? What about this way? There seems to be no definitive way to say, yes, I have a many-to-many relationship, and I want to control and add something now to connect in that relationship. How should I represent it in a RESTful design? There's lots of opinions and lots of ideas, and I've given you some ideas here, and I hope you find them useful.